From the very first skirmishes between ancient tribes to the high-tech conflicts of today, there's one thing that's never changed. The ground beneath a soldier's feet often decides who wins and who loses. Today, we're going to dive into how the simple act of drawing a map became one of the most powerful weapons in all of history. So let's start with a really basic question. Before we had drones, before we even had complex strategies, what was the most primal, the most fundamental rule of a fight? The answer is probably a lot simpler than you think. That's it. Take the high ground. This one, single, timeless idea is the absolute bedrock of strategic geography. It's all about being able to see what your enemy is doing, having a better defensive position, and, let's be honest, the pure psychological edge of looking down on your opponent. For literally thousands of years, commanders have lived and died by this one simple rule. And to really see this in action, let's hop in our time machine and go way back to ancient Greece. This is the classic story, the perfect case study of how a tiny, well-placed force can use the terrain as what we call a force multiplier against a massive, overwhelming enemy. So get this, the Greeks were outnumbered by at least 15 to 1. I mean, the odds were just insane. But they had an ace up their sleeve, the terrain. The narrow pass of Thermopylae was a natural bottleneck, a choke point that completely canceled out the Persians' biggest advantage, their numbers. It forced this huge army to squeeze into a tiny space where all those extra soldiers just got in the way. Okay, so knowing the ground is crucial, right? But how did military leaders go from just having an intuitive feel for the land to a systematic, intelligent analysis? Well, that's where the map enters the story. The whole evolution of military mapping is fascinating. It really started with these ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets, which were basically just for tracking land ownership. But then you get the Romans, who were masters of logistics, and they created these incredibly detailed road maps, like the Tabula Puntignariana, to move their armies around efficiently. And over in China, you have geniuses like Sun Tzu who actually started writing down the rules, codifying just how critical this knowledge really was. As Sun Tzu says here, knowing the ground, knowing the weather, is just as important as knowing your enemy. For him, the battlefield wasn't just a passive backdrop for the fight, it was an active participant in it. And that idea would shape military strategy for centuries to come. But what happens when a brilliant commander, someone at the top of their game, just completely ignores the terrain? What happens when the landscape itself decides to fight back? Well, it can lead to one of the biggest disasters in military history. See, every type of terrain has its own set of rules. Big open plains, great for moving fast, but they also leave you completely exposed. Mountains are like natural fortresses, but they're a total nightmare to try and attack. And forests offer perfect cover, which makes them ideal for an ambush. In short, the land tells you how to fight. And this brings us to Napoleon in 1812. He was arguably the greatest military mind of his time, but he made a catastrophic mistake. He totally misjudged Russia. The sheer vastness of the country stretched his supply lines until they just snapped. The Russians used a scorched earth tactic, basically turning the land itself into a weapon of starvation. And then, General Winter arrived, and the entire landscape transformed into an unbeatable frozen enemy. The result was over 500,000 casualties. It wasn't just the Russian army that defeated Napoleon's Grande Armée, it was the geography of Russia. A truly brutal lesson in what happens when you underestimate the power of the map. For centuries, maps were flat. They could show you roads, they could show you towns, but they couldn't really show you that number one rule of warfare, the high ground. Then, a huge technological leap changed absolutely everything. That revolution was called topography. It was this incredible new science of showing the three-dimensional reality of the land, all the hills, all the valleys, on a completely flat piece of paper. And it was all thanks to a clever little innovation called the contour line. And the impact was immediate. It was a game changer. For the very first time, commanders could actually see the high ground before they even set foot on the battlefield. They could plan where their artillery would go with incredible precision, they could spot the best defensive spots, and they could plot their attacks, all from inside a tent, just by looking at a map. Now, if you want to see the absolute pinnacle of this revolution, you have to look at the planning for the D-Day landings in 1944. It was a true cartographic masterpiece. The Allies didn't just have one map, they had layers and layers of them. Topographical maps of the beaches, special hydrographic charts for the ships, and detailed intelligence maps showing every single German bunker. Every phase of that massive invasion was plotted out on paper first. So, from the incredibly detailed paper plans of D-Day, we're now going to leap forward to the modern day, where that ancient quest to know the ground has entered a totally new dimension. I mean, the shift from the 20th to the 21st century is just dramatic. We've gone from static paper maps to digital maps that update in real time, from old aerial photos to live satellite feeds. The key technology now is the Geographic Information System, or GIS. Just think of it like a super smart map that can layer tons of different data, troop movements, weather, enemy positions, all onto one interactive screen. And of course, GPS changed navigation forever. But what's really incredible is that the fundamental problems are still the same. A Roman general worried about logistics and how to move his troops around, just like a modern commander does. The huge difference is that today, thanks to this digital mapping revolution, those age-old problems can be solved instantly, with a level of precision that somebody like Sun Tzu or Napoleon couldn't even have dreamed of. And this leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to chew on. For millennia, the goal was always to get to the physical high ground for a better view. But in an age of almost perfect information, where satellites can give you a god's eye view of the entire battlefield, what's the new high ground? Is it having more data than the other guy? Is it being able to make decisions faster? That's the question that will define the conflicts of the future.